We're going to hear now from Emma King from VCOSS, and I expect that probably one of your key messages, Emma, picking up on some of what Wade has talked about, is that what's also outstanding about these budgets, particularly the state budget, is that there's such an incredibly strong equity lens that's placed over the top of what's been released at a state level. And so to that extent, it's not surprising that the West has been so well recognised, represented, and the needs in the West responded to. Emma King will also be known to most people in the room as the CEO of VCOSS, the Victorian Council of Social Services, where she's held that role since 2013. Emma provides a strong voice of leadership and advocacy on a broad range of social justice issues for the community sector and the most disadvantaged folks within the Victorian community. Emma has previously been the CEO of Early Learning Australia and has an extensive background in the public sector and in workforce and education issues, also having worked as a Victorian policy advisor, as a teacher, and in a range of industrial and training roles at the Victorian Independent Education Union and the Finance Sector Union. Emma represents VCOSS on a range of ministerial advisory groups and committees. She's also the chair of the Future Social Service Institute, president of the Farnham Street Neighbourhood Learning Centre, and a board member of Mental Health Victoria. Emma is a regular commentator on social affairs and justice issues, and we're really delighted to hear from you today, Emma, to provide a background and an overview on both of the budgets, particularly in terms of how they respond to some of the key social justice issues and recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. I should let folks know we had some challenges getting Emma into the Zoom call, so we're all super relieved, A, that you're here, and B, that we're about to hear from you. So welcome, Emma.
Thank you so much, Jason. And if also I can acknowledge Brooke for his patience as we were kind of going back and forth. I think in this day and age, every event comes with at least one IT challenge, and unfortunately for me today it was me, as in unfortunately for everyone here, but I'm glad to be here, and kudos to the team at Brimbank who made that all possible with as limited sort of stress, etc. as possible. So a huge thank you from me. If I can begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land upon which we all meet on today. I'm on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, so if I can pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and also acknowledge other elders and Aboriginal people who are with us today. I'd also like to acknowledge the other speakers today, having just heard Wade's presentation, and Lindley, I'm very sorry that I missed yours, but I'm looking forward to looking at the slides, etc. later as well. I might jump in, just because of time, I might just sort of jump straight into the slides that I've got here. What I might do, just if we start off on the next slide, Brooke, if that's okay. Brooke's also assisting me with all things IT, which is a far safer thing for everyone on this call. I wanted just to touch on this slide. I'll touch on this slide and the next one quickly, partly because, again, it's great, as I think Wade acknowledged, and as did Jason, there's so many friends on this call for whom I think you're really across this, and I suspect you'll have touched on it today in terms of what's happened with our economy, and just clearly seeing the impact of COVID at both a state and a national level. You'll have heard about this at length in the budget, and I think particularly looking at sort of, we're looking at what's happened to our economy, I guess the level of deficit and spending that we're heading into. So I think the cash deficit's going to hit about 37 billion this year, and then it's projected to go from, it'll be about 23 billion in 18-19 to about 155 billion in 23-24. And I just say that to illustrate actually what I see is significant investment. And a good friend to many of us, David Hayward, who's got the beautiful economic expertise and lens, whom I go to regularly for advice. One of the things David said, you know, at the outset of this is, you know, kind of don't be alarmed. We're actually at a point where interest rates are really low. The state budget is not like a household budget. It's very different in terms of the way the money is rolled over. But our debt is actually very low in comparison to international standards as well, which I think is really important to acknowledge. And one of the things in terms of when we look at the broader commentary, what we're seeing here is we've got the Reserve Bank saying, actually now is the time to spend and spend big. And I think the test is where you spend and where you spend in terms of looking at the economy and the society and the well-being of everyone who lives there. And what we're seeing particularly in terms of the state budget is that significant investment into the well-being. And when we're looking at infrastructure projects, things like social housing, which I'll touch on in more detail, and those sort of infrastructure programs and the care programs that are actually a significant investment in our economy. So I just wanted to pick that up as well. If you could just jump to the next slide, that'd be great, Brooke. The next slide, when it comes up, bear with me, you might just have it. Oh yeah, beautiful. In terms of unemployment, I think this is something, again, that everyone on this call will be very highly attuned to. The slide here picks up unemployment, underemployment and underutilisation rates. And we all know that's been pretty horrific and magnified in Victoria, in Melbourne, I should say, particularly central Melbourne, because of the stage 4 component. One of the things as well, when we look at the issue, I think, around unemployment and underemployment, remembering that if you only work an hour a week, you're suddenly considered to be employed. So I think it's important to show the impact in this way. And I'll be interested to see the next set of data as it starts to play out, knowing that some industries are starting to reopen. And I think there's that significant divide. And being someone who at the moment is trying to get hold of a couple of tradespeople whom I know have got work like they've said they've never had before, compared to others who just can't pick up work, or they've been entirely displaced from their work. And I think the next slide, if we jump forward to that one, because it gives that picture around unemployment and underemployment and kind of who's been impacted and impacted the most. And I think we've heard lots of language around particularly the impact on women, the impact on, and that's been described in various ways, would be the pink recession or she-cession, etc. as well. But it's overwhelmingly young people as well as women, but then as well as people who are older as well. And these slides, what I'm mindful of is, in terms of when we look at these slides, they don't necessarily show that there's a lot of people who've left the workforce. So we know that once COVID hit, a number of people actually stopped looking for jobs. They either stopped or they were prevented from looking for employment because they had significant caring responsibilities. So we know with things like with homeschooling kids and all those sorts of things, that had a really big impact on people, as did the need to care for others. So if you're not able, if you've got someone who actually needs care or support, but that person wasn't able to enter your home, then you're having to take time off work or not look for work during that period as well. So I just wanted to frame that more generally. And I think it also helps frame why the Victorian government was framed as it has been in terms of looking at a jobs budget, because we know we've just got to really focus on how we stimulate the economy. It actually fits in really beautifully, I think, with the presentation that you just gave as well, Wade, in terms of looking at, when we look at some of the parts of our economy that I think have traditionally been overlooked and some of the places where people live and need to work, there's huge opportunity that comes in there. I think government's pretty optimistic, both state and federal, in terms of looking at the employment figures going forward. I guess they can't really be anything else, but even at looking at unemployment figures going forward in the budget papers, which is over 5%, it's still pretty high. It's all relative, but still pretty high. But nonetheless, looking at a jobs budget, making that a central feature, I think has been a really positive thing. I might jump forward to the next slide if I can. The headlines here, and I think certainly Wade touched on these, Lindley may well have as well. In all honesty, I've been to a lot of budget lockups. I've never felt as excited as I did in the last budget in terms of looking at the announcements, the magnitude of the announcements, and I'll touch on each of them in a bit of detail. But also, I think the joining up component. So when we look at the fact that a number of announcements that I won't even touch on today, but I'll just mention briefly. But, some of the announcements in terms of looking at called communities, some of the announcements in looking at libraries, and the other parts of the ecosystem that is our community, and talks about, to me, about the well-being of every Victorian and every Victorian community. Normally they would have been a press release in and of themselves, and this year they didn't make it because there was so much else that was in there. So I'll talk to each of these as we kind of go through, but it was pretty phenomenal is what I can say. So we might jump to the next one, and then I'll kind of have a running sort of commentary as we go. But looking at the housing and homelessness package to begin with, when we look at the investment in social housing, all I can say is my state and territory colleagues around the country are looking at this saying, we can't, they would desperately love what we've got. I think one of the things that we know is if we were to have the federal government step up and kind of match it, would just be phenomenal. But keeping in mind that it was considered a very big announcement in the last election, and albeit we called it a down payment, quite rightly, of 1,000 public housing properties over 4 years in the last state budget. It speaks, and on the back of actually pretty much no new housing for many, many years in terms of social housing, to have 9,300 new community housing homes, and looking at the investment in social housing more broadly is significant. I think it's also significant that some of it is quite intentionally tagged for particular components of particular members of our community, so Aboriginal housing for people with mental illness, etc., and being very deliberate about that. There's also some priority areas in there, and I think one of the things that will be of interest to people on this call is knowing that there's still a lot that's up for discussion. So there's a lot of care, I think, around saying we're not just going to name everything up front, because it's kind of an easy thing to do, but I think we come back and pay the price. There's kind of allocations in areas, knowing there's 25% in regional Victoria, but in terms of looking more broadly, there's some very specific initial allocation areas, but there is room for much more conversation about where there is real need. I know there's a lot of commentary at the moment, actually, in terms of looking at the hotel accommodation. Some of that's a bit tricky, for want of a better term, but what I would recognise is the intent around moving people into long-term permanent housing, because that is critically important. And inevitably, when we move into the stage of, the implementation stage, there's often challenges that are attached to that, but nonetheless, it's going to be worth us working through those. And I think we will all have to work through those together, because this is actually about moving people who are homeless or in incredibly tenuous housing situations into having a home, into having somewhere that's safe, affordable, appropriate to live. And that is fantastic. And the other thing I would really like to call out, because it's been significant, and we have worked closely with Minister Horn around the emergency rental measures. Absolute kudos to government on this one, because again, the fact that they've been extended through to March, potentially April for next year, that's been pretty phenomenal. Now we know we're going to have to keep a really close eye on that with JobSeeker and JobKeeper, etc., in terms of whether there needs to be a further extension. But I do want to really recognise that, because I think with the magnitude of the big housing build, it's easy to overlook that. But we know we've got more people renting than who've ever rented before, and the impact of the rental measures are really important. So if we could jump to the next slide. I am mindful of time, so I won't spend as long on each one, but I'm very excited about the housing package, I have to admit. Jobs and skills, again, I'll let people kind of have a quick look at this themselves rather than talking through everything in detail. One of the other things to note here as well, I think, is the pilot program for people who are employed casually to have access to 5 days sick or carers leave a year. One of the things that we all know is that COVID has absolutely magnified where there are areas of inequality. It's magnified issues, for example, if you're working in aged care or if you're working in disability and you're having to potentially hold down work in maybe 5 different workplaces in order to be able to get enough hours and to be able to pay your bills. That's something we're actually going to have to really address moving forward. And it's unfortunate that I think that a pandemic has lifted it to the level of attention that it's always deserved. But as I mentioned earlier, I think one of the key things we've seen here is that significant investment in jobs, in wage subsidies, etc. For a number of the things that you're looking at here, again, I think there's still a lot of work, understandably, to be done in the implementation stage. And I'm pretty excited about what that will look like. And looking again how it tags in with the presentation that Wade just gave, to think, well, actually, how does this kind of help us tag in where there's particular opportunities in particular communities? How do we actually go towards making all of these things join up? And there's enormous opportunity in there, and enormous opportunity, I think, in that sort of that recovery workforce, particularly, and from my end as well, I'm really looking at community services. They're jobs that can't be automated. They're jobs we're all going to need, and we're going to need more of, but also knowing that for some of the construction jobs, I'm thrilled that actually they've gone to areas such as social housing. And there's also some procurement, and again, call out to Wade on this one, who I know has done an awful lot of work in that sort of procurement space, very clear targets around, for example, having women employed in apprenticeships and those sorts of things. So, but acknowledging that that hasn't happened yet. So there's a bit of work to be done to make that happen, but really a call out on that one. I'll jump to the next slide, and I'm just going to have a quick look at time, so I might need to move it along a bit. Free Kinder in 2020 is phenomenal. The new funding model for students with disability is incredible in terms of it's actually going to double a number of students who can get support in the classroom and pick up many students who currently miss out because they don't meet particular criteria. So therefore they're knocked out of getting assistance altogether. This is, having worked in this space previously, when I saw the detail of this announcement, it's actually phenomenal and possibly much better than a number of people currently realise. It's a very strong strengths-based model, and it's going to provide assistance to a number of children who currently miss out on support. I won't go into that in detail just because of the timing, but it is it's something to keep an eye on, because we know when we look at schools and early learning, basically we know if a student starts school and they are behind, it is almost impossible for them to catch up without significant intervention. So this is a huge announcement on top of the 3-year-old kinder, 4-year-old kinder, and then looking at the assistance for kids with disability as well. So I'll jump to the next one, but again, another one I'm really excited about. It's actually hard to not be excited about most of this, to be honest. Health and mental health. People would be aware that we've got the Royal Commission into Mental Health that's being handed down soon. So the government's already committed to funding that. A huge mental health package that's been delivered as a response to the interim report of the Royal Commission, but we know there's much more to come here. There's other components in here that, again, I'm mindful of time, I won't jump into, but again, pretty significant investments in mental health, knowing that there's more to come. And I'm mindful, given that we've just had a budget in November, we've got another one coming in May. I would expect to see much more for mental health as well coming in the May budget. I might move forward to the next one. Thank you. Children and families. Again, this was an interesting example of another one that in any normal year, the first dot point here would have been a pretty huge press release in and of itself, and yet it wasn't in the pack, I don't think, on budget day, because it was just such a big budget. But knowing that, and it is a great article that Jill Topsfield had in the paper today, and Liana Buchanan released a report yesterday around the number of kids who exit sort of foster care or resi care type arrangements and actually end up in our justice system, or end up unemployed, end up homeless, etc. This is a pretty phenomenal announcement around the Home Stretch campaign and allowing young people to stay with their existing foster, parents or kinship sort of arrangements up to 21 years. I think that's going to provide an awful amount of a great amount of scaffolding. Another one I'm personally very excited about, but I'm kind of keen to look at this one in a bit more detail and potentially ramp it up. The Get Active Kids voucher. I just think it's so wrong that basically you get to pay sport if you've got enough money to be able to pay, and if you don't, you miss out. It's such a strong strength-based component. So I am looking at the figures, to be honest, around here. I'm thinking right back when the EMA existed, I know there was about 250,000 students who were on the EMA at the time, and we've had significant growth. I'm keen to look at the numbers here in a bit more detail, because we want to make sure these vouchers get to every kid who needs them. I won't touch on everything else because it's there, other than the ACOs is really important in terms of looking at that importance of Aboriginal assistance for Aboriginal children and our Aboriginal population, and that connection back to ACOs and that connection to country, etc., as well, is really important. I might just jump through quickly the next ones. Energy efficiency. It's actually quite hard, I have to say, to truncate this because there is so much in there. I am assuming people on the call are probably across a lot of this, but again, I said to the Minister when we got the little shout out about this one beforehand, one of the really nice things about this announcement, and kudos to the Minister, because it's pretty tricky, I think, to get all of these things up together. This knits back in really neatly with a social housing announcement, because the social housing properties that will be built are 7-star efficiency. Plus, we know with existing homes that one of the biggest issues we have is around the cost of energy. We've got people who are presenting to hospitals that are close to dying in winter because they haven't turned their heater on. They're so worried about what the cost is. And the need for us to make sure that people can access affordable heating and cooling is really important. So these announcements around for existing social housing properties, the energy efficiency upgrades, plus that replacing old heaters with efficient reverse cycle conditioners is a really good one, as is a solar panel rebates and the power saving bonus for Victorian households if for people who are more vulnerable, acknowledging there's people who miss out there. So if you look at, for example, young people, people who are on temporary protection visas, etc., for a raft of reasons they miss out. But I'll jump through this one. But again, just wanting to call out the energy efficiency component. Federal budget, I have to say, I think there's a really interesting contrast to me between the state and the federal budget, in that the state went really hard into looking at the Victorian community and the well-being of the Victorian community. The federal budget, the biggest call out for me is around job seeker, and the fact that there still is no permanent increase to the job seeker payment. And we've got the coronavirus supplement being reduced again in January. This, I think, is something that everyone on this call will be acutely aware of in terms of looking at the number of people who are going to need a hand. And when the coronavirus supplement was at its highest level, what we saw was actually people who are on job seeker for the first time being able to afford food, being able to afford medicine, and also putting their money straight back into the economy, because they've got such a small amount of money. They're investing it immediately into necessary things, but straight back into the economy. So A, it was a great thing for them because they weren't living in abject poverty, but B, it was stimulating the economy at the same time. The contrast, I think, in terms of no investment in social housing, early childhood and care, those sorts of things, and that support for people on temporary visas isn't there. The wage subsidies for people under 35 and that sort of job maker announcement is an interesting one. There's concerns that I have around, well, what about if you're over 35, but also potentially displacing people in existing roles? It's something I'm quite concerned about. I think we'll need to see as that pays out. I'll jump to the next slide. I think it touches on equal pay funding a little bit more as well. There's a bit more around jobs and income, which I'll just touch on there. I think I might have mentioned most of these as well. Probably my biggest personal bugbear is around personal tax cuts being brought forward. So if you're going to look at, kind of goes to the point I made at the start about you invest where it matters. And I think it's the interesting choice that, and knowing they're at different levels, if you like, in terms of state and federal government, but it's an interesting choice for a government to make, to say, well, actually, rather than helping people who are doing it tough, particularly during COVID, we're actually going to give tax cuts to people who are doing fine. And I think that is a really strong show around where priorities are, to be perfectly frank. And I think when you look at the winding back of supports, etc., it just speaks to that part around governments fund what they value, and we can see that that shift. Might jump to the next one. Community services, equal remuneration order. Everyone I think on this call will be acutely aware of that. That was a real concern for us in terms of looking at contracts where this is pretty much falling off a cliff. You can see there who's been funded, who hasn't. So there's some good news stories in there, and there's still some unfinished work that we're going to need to look at. The other one is around cuts to services for people seeking asylum, which was one of those tricky ones that was hard to sort of find through the initial cut of the budget papers, but that's going to be pretty significant as well. I'll jump to the next one. I'm really mindful I'm running over time here. Health, telehealth, I think, is a good one. Again, keeping in mind of what that means for in terms of digital divide, but overall, and there's lots of unanswered questions around that. One would talk to for a while, but I think it's good that we've had a more recent announcement as well around telehealth and the continuation of telehealth and some funding there around mental health. Perhaps if you jump forward to the next one as well. Next steps. So next steps, budget in May. So pretty quick turnaround in terms of looking at budget in May. And I'd also just call out the fact that if you're interested in the greater detail in each of the state budget announcements, we've done a detailed analysis, and you can jump onto the VCOSS website and have a look at the more detailed analysis for any of those. We've looked at the things that kind of don't make the headlines on budget day, as well as those that do, and having undertaken an analysis there, which anyone's welcome to jump on and look at. And we're about to start our state budget consultation, I think next week, if not the week after, for the May budget as well. So apologies, I think I've gone slightly over, Jason, but I'll hand back to you. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much, Emma.